Welcome, friends, to Justice Reloaded HD, where stories don't just entertain, they heal. Let me ask you something real, something honest. When was the last time you cried? And more importantly, was anyone there to wipe your tears? You see, some of the most powerful moments in life don't come with grand gestures or loud applause. Sometimes, all it takes is a soft hand, a quiet presence, and a heart that knows when not to speak. Today's story begins with silent tears, the kind you hide when no one's watching, and ends with a change so unexpected, it might just stay with you long after the screen goes dark. But before we begin, if your heart leans towards stories that reach deep, if you believe in kindness that asks for nothing in return, go ahead and click that like button. Subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Every week, we bring you one story. One chance to feel, to remember, to heal. The diner sat tucked away on a quiet street in Lexington, Kentucky, the kind of place where time moved slower, and strangers sometimes became family over coffee and late breakfasts. It wasn't fancy. Vinyl booths with a little wear in the seams, the soft clink of ceramic mugs, and a radio playing old country ballads set the tone. But it had something rare, a children's corner in the back, not far from the window. Just a shelf of storybooks, some worn crayons in an old cookie tin, and a small table scarred by years of doodles. It was a small haven, overlooked by most, but cherished by the few who needed it. On a cold Monday morning, a man sat near the window, alone, except for the boy beside him. His name was Philip Grant. 61, dressed in a dark tailored coat that somehow made him look more distant than powerful. He was one of the richest men in the state, an insurance magnate whose name held weight in every boardroom from Frankfurt to New York. But here, he looked like any man you wouldn't want to bother, silent, stiff, and maybe even a little broken in ways money could never fix. He stirred his coffee but didn't drink it. He read the menu but didn't seem hungry. Across from him sat his son, Mason. 9 years old. Small for his age. Shoulders hunched in, arms tight at his sides. He didn't speak. Didn't move much either. Just stared down at the paper placemat in front of him, a crayon clutched in one hand but no drawing to show for it. His eyes flicked toward the children's corner once, then away. As if even the thought of playing felt too heavy. The waitress on duty had seen them before. She didn't know their names, but she remembered the boy, the way he always sat too still, the way he flinched when the bell above the door chimed too loud. She'd once caught him crying quietly, not loudly, just a shimmer in his eyes that never spilled. And no one, not even the man she assumed was his father, ever touched him. Not a pat on the back. Not a word of comfort. Just silence. Her name was Haley Monroe. 34, mother of none, but she'd once volunteered at a grief support center for kids. Not because it was part of any career plan, but because she knew what it felt like to be a child left alone with sadness too big to carry. She'd learned something there. Some kids don't want to talk. They don't want to be asked what's wrong. They just want someone to sit with them, without trying to fix it. So, she didn't approach them right away. Just kept a quiet eye as she refilled mugs and wiped counters. But something about that morning felt different. Maybe it was the way the boy's fingers trembled slightly as he tried to draw. Maybe it was the way his father stood up and walked toward the register, leaving him sitting alone at the table like a shadow. Maybe it was the way pain hangs in the air, thick and still, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Whatever it was, Haley reached into her apron for a clean napkin. Not the rough paper kind, but one of the soft ones she kept folded for kids with runny noses or chocolate on their cheeks. She stepped quietly toward the boy, not saying a word. And Mason didn't look up. Not yet. But he didn't flinch either. And that, she knew, meant everything. Mason sat alone at the booth, legs swinging just above the floor, eyes fixed on the corner of the table where the crayon had rolled and stopped. Philip had stepped away, just for a moment, to pay at the front. It wasn't far. The boy was in full view, but still, something shifted the second his father turned his back. The tremble started in Mason's shoulders. Subtle at first. Barely a twitch. But then his chin tucked in, and his fingers curled under the table, gripping at nothing. His breathing changed, sharp inhales through the nose, a tiny hitch in his chest. He didn't make a sound. No sob. No cry. But the tears began anyway, tracing silent lines down the soft curve of his cheeks. No one noticed. No one but her. Haley had been restocking creamers near the coffee station, halfway across the diner. But instinct has a strange way of pulling you, not with logic, but with quiet knowing. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She just moved. There was no speech rehearsed, no comforting smile. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't crouch down and make silly faces like adults do when they try too hard. She simply slipped a clean napkin from her apron, soft, folded in quarters, and walked gently toward the boy as if stepping into someone else's dream. Mason didn't lift his head. Didn't flinch. Not even when she knelt beside the booth, lowering herself slowly until her face was just above the table's edge. She paused, just a breath, waiting, not pushing. Then, as if he'd been waiting too, Mason turned his face slightly, just enough to expose the tears glistening near his jawline. He didn't look at her. But he didn't pull away either. And with the kind of care reserved for sacred things, Haley reached up and dabbed the napkin to his cheek. Once. Gently. Then again, a little higher, near the corner of his eye. He blinked, but didn't cry harder. Didn't stiffen. It was the kind of silence that echoed, the kind that said more than words ever could. She didn't wipe like she was trying to make the tears disappear. She moved as if she understood they belonged there, and her only job was to help carry them, just a little. A soft breath escaped Mason's lips. Not quite a sigh, but something close. And his head tilted, just slightly, leaning toward her hand, toward the napkin, toward the unfamiliar feeling of being allowed to cry without being fixed. Across the room, Philip turned back. He didn't expect much. Just a glance to ensure his son hadn't wandered off. But when his eyes found the booth again, he stopped mid-step. There she was, the waitress, kneeling beside his son, her hand midair with a napkin. And there was Mason, still silent, leaning into the moment like it was the first warmth he'd felt in years. Philip didn't speak. Didn't move. His breath caught. In all the months since the accident, since the funeral, since the endless sessions with therapists and counselors, not once had Mason allowed anyone near him when he cried. Not even his own father. And now this woman, a stranger in a faded apron, was there beside him, and Mason didn't just allow it, he welcomed it. Philip's fingers tightened slightly around the receipt in his hand. Something was happening. Something he didn't understand, and couldn't afford to interrupt. So he watched in silence as a boy cried without fear, and a waitress offered nothing but presence, a soft napkin, and the kind of tenderness that can't be taught. The next morning arrived with a chill in the air and the scent of rain just beginning to creep through the streets of Lexington. Haley showed up for her usual shift at the diner, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. She poured coffee, took orders, smiled at regulars, but something about her felt off. She kept glancing toward the corner booth where Mason and Philip had sat the day before, as if expecting to see the boy's quiet eyes watching her from behind the salt shakers. But they didn't return that morning. Instead, a black town car pulled up outside just after 11. It idled quietly at the curb, sleek and still, too polished for a place like this. Haley noticed it through the diner's front window but didn't pay much mind, until the driver stepped inside. He was older, with a crisp black suit and the kind of posture that only came from years of quiet service. He removed his hat respectfully and approached the counter, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. "Miss Monroe?" he asked gently. She turned, eyebrows raised. "Yes. I was sent by Mr. Grant. He asked me to deliver a message personally." The air around her seemed to still. A few other customers paused, pretending not to listen, but failing miserably. The driver reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded note, One sheet of thick paper, the kind you'd expect from someone who owned stock in a paper mill. Haley unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was firm. Slanted slightly, like the writer was used to signing contracts, not letters. Miss Monroe, I do not require your service as a waitress. But my son occasionally needs someone gentle enough to wipe away his tears without making him feel ashamed for having them. If you are willing, I'd like to invite you to our home. Not for therapy. Not for any professional obligation. Just for presence. Philip Grant. She stared at the words for a long moment, her lips parting slightly, but no sound coming out. The driver waited, calm and unhurried. I don't know, she whispered more to herself than to anyone else. No one had ever written her something like that. No one had ever seen what she did with such clarity, not even the parents at the grief center where she used to volunteer. She folded the note and tucked it gently into her apron. I'll think about it, she said. The driver gave a respectful nod and left. Haley went through the rest of her shift like someone moving through fog. She wasn't sure what to make of it. The invitation, the boy, the silence that had passed between them. She had wiped 1,000 children's tears before, but never had one of them drawn her afterward. Because that's what happened. When her shift ended, she returned to her small apartment, poured herself a glass of water, and opened the mailbox outside her door, expecting bills and maybe a coupon or two. Instead, tucked between the envelopes, was a rolled piece of paper, bound with a yellow rubber band. She recognized the childish scribble immediately. Unrolling it, she saw crayon lines, uneven, bright, full of emotion. Two figures sat side by side. One held a square shape, a napkin perhaps, to the other's face. Neither had eyes or mouths, just outlines and a sense of stillness. But the feeling hit her all the same. She placed a hand over her chest. Some children never say thank you. But some, they draw it. They remember it. And Haley knew in that moment, her life had quietly shifted, not with fanfare, but with a crayon and a folded note. Haley never brought games or books when she visited. She didn't come armed with questions, or a list of strategies like a therapist might. In fact, she barely spoke at all unless spoken to. When she stepped into the Grant home, it was never with the intention to fix, diagnose, or entertain. She came with only one thing in her pocket, a soft packet of tissues, the kind that didn't scratch or sting. That and time. Every visit, Mason was already there, usually sitting near the window in the den, a box of crayons by his side, but rarely drawing. Some days, he didn't even look up when she arrived. Other days, his eyes followed her just briefly before drifting back to the floor. And Haley, she honored the silence. She didn't ask how he was feeling. She didn't tell him to cheer up or explain what had happened. She just sat a few feet away, sometimes in a chair, sometimes on the floor, legs folded beneath her. Her presence was soft, non-invasive, like a lamp turned low in the corner of a dark room. The tissues stayed folded in her lap. She never offered them unless Mason gave a signal, and even then, it was unspoken. A glance. A slow lean in her direction. A subtle shift in posture. The kind of communication that didn't need words. And when the moment came, she moved gently. No sudden gestures. No dramatic sympathy. Just a hand raised, a single dab at the tear tracks on his cheek, and then stillness again. Sometimes he nodded. Other times, he said nothing at all. But the way his shoulders lowered, the way his body seemed to exhale, that was enough. It was their rhythm. She never praised him for crying. Never told him he was so brave or so strong. She didn't have to. What she gave him was far rarer, the permission to fall apart, without being told to pull himself back together. He never recoiled from her touch, not anymore. But he never rushed toward it either. Their connection lived in the in-between spaces, in the silence between sobs, the weight of quiet company, and the small comfort of knowing someone was near, but would never demand more than he could give. And that, perhaps, was the very thing he needed most. Haley understood what few people did, that some wounds didn't respond to noise or effort. Some simply asked for presence. And so she showed up. Every time. No expectations. No rewards. Just a soft hand, and the patience to wait. It didn't happen all at once. Mason didn't wake up one day and become a different child. But slowly, quietly, things began to shift. He started choosing to sit a little closer to Haley. Not beside her, not quite. But near enough that he could reach out if he wanted to. He began to draw more too, not just scribbles and color blocks, but shapes. People. Moments. A figure with long brown hair and a square of tissue in one hand appeared more than once in his pages. Sometimes, he would push a drawing across the floor toward her, wordless. Other times he spoke, just a few words, barely above a whisper, but unmistakably his. "Your hands are soft," he said one afternoon. Haley looked up from her seat, surprised. She smiled gently but didn't reply. She didn't want to crowd the moment. Mason reached for another crayon, his fingers moving slowly. Then he paused. "You don't wipe too hard," he added. She tilted her head. "Is that good?" He nodded. "It doesn't hurt. You do it right." Haley didn't say anything more. She just folded the tissue in her hand and gave a quiet nod in return. From the hallway, Philip watched. He had no intention of eavesdropping. But something about the boy's voice, soft, clear, free of tension, made him stop in his tracks. He stood just out of view, his hand resting against the wall, and listened to the stillness that had replaced so many months of anguish. It was the first time he'd heard his son say anything kind to another person in nearly a year. 4 months after the accident, Philip had poured money into every avenue he could think of: child psychologists, grief counselors, sensory therapists. He'd turned their estate into a rotating door of professionals, all well-meaning, all credentialed, all ineffective. Mason never responded. Never spoke. Never let them close. But now, here was this woman, this waitress, sitting barefoot on his den floor, holding a tissue like it was a sacred instrument. And his son was blooming. It didn't go unnoticed by others in the household. One of his longest-serving staff, a family advisor who had overseen everything from legal matters to private schooling, approached Philip late one evening in the study. "She's a sweet girl, sir," the advisor said carefully, "but she has no clinical background. No certifications. No training in child psychology." Philip didn't look up from his desk. "I know," he replied. The advisor hesitated. "You're trusting her with something very delicate." Philip finally looked up, his eyes tired but steady. "She's the first person to treat my son like a person, not a problem," he said. "She doesn't diagnose him. She doesn't ask him to perform. She just respects him." He paused, voice softening. "And maybe that's the one thing he's never gotten. Not from the experts. Not from the family. Not even from me." The advisor didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Because Philip wasn't defending a decision. He was confessing a truth. It started with a headline. Buried deep in a parenting blog, nestled between back-to-school lunch tips and opinion pieces on screen time, the photo appeared without warning. A candid snapshot, slightly blurred, clearly taken through the wide front window of the diner. In the image, Haley was kneeling beside Mason, her hand raised, dabbing at his tear-streaked cheek with a soft white napkin. The boy's eyes were closed. His face was turned gently toward her, vulnerable and open. And above it, in bold print, the title screamed, "Billionaire hires waitress to soothe son with tissue therapy." It was meant to be sensational, clickbait masquerading as commentary. But it traveled fast. Within hours, it had been shared across parenting forums, local gossip circles, and eventually into the inbox of someone on Philip Grant's public relations team. When Philip saw it, his blood turned to ice. He didn't finish reading the piece. He didn't scroll down to see the comments, or the guesses at who the woman was, or the snide remarks about emotional nannies. All he saw was his son, a boy who had spent months refusing touch, finally letting someone in, now exposed to the world like a curiosity. The ache that followed was swift, sharp, and laced with betrayal. He hadn't protected Mason well enough. And worse, he had trusted someone to do what he himself could not: comfort his child. He had let her into their home, their grief, their fragile rhythm. And now it was all public. He didn't call her. He didn't give her a chance to explain. He simply gave instructions. No more visits. No more access. No response to the blog. No statement. Just silence. When the town car showed up outside Haley's apartment 2 days later, it didn't come with a note or a driver stepping out with a message. It simply idled for 5 minutes, then pulled away. She knew then. The absence was louder than any words could have been. At first, she thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone in the household had seen the photo and assumed she had called the press. Maybe there was still a way to explain, to say that she had no idea anyone had taken that picture. That she hadn't shared a thing. That what happened between her and Mason had never been for show. But no one came. No one asked. So she didn't chase. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed, still in her work clothes, holding a crumpled tissue between her fingers, one of the soft ones she always brought with her. Not because she expected Mason to need it anymore, but because it had become part of how she showed up, quietly, gently, ready. Now, the silence pressed in around her. She thought about the boy. The way he leaned in without speaking. The way he never said thank you, but always gave something back. A glance, a drawing, a breath. And she wondered if he felt abandoned now. Or confused. Or worse, if he thought she had meant to hurt him. She folded the tissue into a neat square and placed it inside an envelope. Then she wrote a note, not to defend herself, not to beg, but to say what needed saying. I would never keep someone else's tears. I only ever held them gently, so they didn't have to be alone while they fell. She mailed it to the Grant estate with no return address. And then, she waited for nothing. Haley didn't try to explain. She didn't write a long letter or attempt to defend herself in a phone call that would never come. There were no angry words, no accusations, no desperate pleas. She understood the silence, and respected it, even if it cut deeper than she expected. What she did instead was simple. She opened her drawer and took out the same soft tissue she had folded that first day, the one she'd used to wipe Mason's tears. It had been washed once, carefully, by hand. Not because she wanted to reuse it, but because something about it felt sacred now, a reminder of the moment she'd been allowed into a child's grief without asking for anything in return. She placed it into a plain white envelope, along with a small note, handwritten in her unpolished but careful script. No heading. No signature. I never keep anyone's tears. I only ever held them gently, so they wouldn't be afraid to fall. That was all. No explanation. No justification. She sealed the envelope and walked it down herself to the post office. No express shipping, no tracking number. Just a quiet delivery to the Grant estate, addressed only to Philip Grant. Then she walked away from the counter and out into the afternoon sun. There was a heaviness in her chest, but also a strange calm. She had said what mattered. Not to clear her name, but to speak the only truth that counted. If he read it, he would know. And if he didn't, then at least the boy had known. Sometimes, that had to be enough. The truth came quietly, as truths often do, not in a dramatic reveal, but in a passing comment made during a casual conversation in the Grant household. It was one of the younger kitchen staff, recounting how a local blogger had posted a photo taken at the diner. She'd recognized the username, someone who often reviewed coffee shops and mom-friendly brunch spots. According to her, the woman had been sitting 2 tables over from the Grants that day, sipping herbal tea and snapping pictures for her blog. She wasn't a journalist. She wasn't a friend of Haley's. She hadn't spoken to anyone at the table. She was just there. And like many people these days, she had mistaken a moment of quiet grace for something worth broadcasting. Philip listened in silence. He didn't react. Didn't correct the staff member or ask for details. He just nodded and walked away. But inside, something shifted, a tightening in his chest that wasn't anger this time, but shame. He had drawn his own conclusions. He had severed ties without asking a single question. And now, the boy was paying for it. Because Mason hadn't said a word in 3 days. He hadn't drawn. Hadn't touched his crayons or glanced at the tissue box Haley used to keep nearby. He sat by the window most afternoons, staring at nothing, knees pulled up to his chest. He didn't flinch when Philip entered the room, but he didn't respond either. He just seemed smaller somehow, as if the little light he had let in had been shut out too soon. No one in the house dared say it aloud, but everyone felt it. The silence was back, heavier than before. Philip stood at the doorway one evening, watching his son sit cross-legged on the floor, still as a statue. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to reach him. The loss of Haley's presence wasn't just noticeable, it was haunting. And the worst part? Mason hadn't even asked where she went. Because some children, after losing too many things, stop expecting anyone to stay. The late afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, casting soft shadows across Mason's bedroom floor. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of paper. Philip stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, unnoticed for a moment. Mason was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, his small hands carefully folding something over and over. Tissue paper, the kind Haley always brought. There was a small pile of them beside him, each one folded into a simple shape. Not perfect. Not symmetrical. But clearly made with purpose. Philip stepped inside, slow and quiet. He watched as Mason placed one folded tissue beside another, arranging them in a pattern. 2 small figures made of paper, one kneeling, the other sitting still, facing each other. His chest tightened. Mason didn't look up, but his hands paused, as if he could feel the presence in the room. Philip knelt beside him, his voice low, almost afraid to break the moment. "Do you miss her?" he asked, the words catching slightly in his throat. Mason stared at the folded figures for a long second. Then he nodded, just once. "But not because she stopped me from crying," he said softly. Philip turned toward him, confused. "She didn't," Mason continued. "She just made it okay to cry." The room fell into stillness again, but something had shifted, something fragile but real. Philip placed a hand gently on the floor beside his son, careful not to touch the paper figures. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own child's life. It took Philip several days to find her. He made calls, sifted through old appointment records, even asked one of his assistants to quietly check volunteer programs in the area. He wasn't sure why he expected her to still be doing what she'd always done, showing up in quiet places, helping without attention, but somehow, he wasn't surprised when he found her name on the roster of a weekend art program for children with emotional trauma. The center was tucked behind a church in the south end of Lexington, all hand-painted signs and worn beanbags, and walls covered in finger-painted galaxies and rainbows. Philip stood at the edge of the room for a moment before he saw her. Haley was kneeling beside a child, showing him how to blend colors on paper towels before moving to the canvas. Her voice was soft, her sleeves rolled up, and the corners of her eyes crinkled with a kind of peace he hadn't seen on her face the last time they spoke, or didn't. He waited until the activity ended before he stepped forward. "I never got to say thank you," he began. She turned, startled but composed, her gaze cautious. "I never needed you to," she replied gently. Philip took a breath. "You wiped my son's tears when I couldn't even face them. And I thought it made him weaker. But it didn't." Haley didn't interrupt. She waited. "I want to learn," he said quietly, voice shaking just a little. "Not how to fix things. Not how to stop the pain. Just how to be there. Without making someone feel small for feeling. Her eyes softened. And that's how Soft Hands was born. Together they built it from the ground up, a program not for therapists, not for professionals, but for parents, guardians, teachers, volunteers, anyone willing to learn how to hold space for a child in pain. No lectures. No charts. Just small lessons in quiet presence. In timing. In dignity. The first training session was held in a converted library room. Folded chairs, easels, a table of tissues in every texture and kind. Philip gave the welcome speech, brief and measured. But the room didn't come alive until Mason stepped in. He was holding a drawing, crayon on construction paper, bright but careful. He didn't speak as he held it up to the class. He simply pointed. It showed a small figure sitting cross-legged, holding a handkerchief. Across from them was another smaller figure, tears sketched in blue across a round face. At the bottom, in big uneven letters, was a single sentence. Don't be afraid to cry, if someone knows how to wipe it right. Haley felt the words press into her chest like a quiet echo. Philip looked down at his son, then up at the room of strangers leaning forward to read. And for the first time in a long, long time he smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally begun. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can help heal the deepest wounds, leave a like on this video. And if you'd like to hear more stories of quiet healing and unexpected grace, subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Thank you for staying with us till the end. We'll see you next time.